the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, I was informed by myself yesterday that time travel is indeed possible. For those curious, the winning lottery numbers for tomorrow are 16, 54, 31, 9, 8, which is coincidentally the code for the nuclear football. A new planet was discovered in Solar System 39 Gamma. It is believed that the life forms present eat a combination of flames and calamari to survive. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. All right now.
Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen intern Jonathan Graubard, and I'm joined today by my fellow explorer and intern, Allie Heilman, from Liaden University. Today, first, say hello, Allie.
Hello.
Today, we have been sent to Mars to complete our duties of mapping out the star systems as far away as possible from Tony Daniel, who has allowed us to take a break from the rack. On the plus side, I am now 2 inches taller and on Mars.
This time, we talk with Eric Flint and Walt Boys, the editors of the Grantville Gazette, a collection from the popular Ring of Fire universe. After an inexplicable cosmic disturbance sends a West Virginia mining town to the middle of the 30 Years' War, history changes forever. In addition, we are joined by authors in the collection Bjorn Hasseler, Carolyn Palmer, Gorg, Huff, Griffin Barber, Paula Goodlett, Robert Waters, and Virginia DeMarce.
And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Liaden Universe novel, Alliance of Equals. But first, here's the news.
It's time to announce the new EARCs for June. What is an EARC, you may ask? Well, it's an extraordinary apple rejuvenization circle, perfect for restoring apples that have sat for just a bit too long to their original pristine condition. Not really. An EARC is an electronic advanced reading copy that is available for purchase on Baen.com. You can get your fix for your favorite authors weeks, sometimes months, in advance. Only catch is they aren't quite ready yet. There will be typos. You have been warned. But they are still well written and worth every penny.
This month, we are rolling out 2 EARCs. Target Rich Environment by Larry Correa and Her Majesty's American by Steve White. Target Rich Environment is a short story collection of 14 action-packed tales full of demons, monsters, vampires, and cosmic horrors too terrible to name, and toss in an interdimensional insurance salesman thrown in for good measure. Her Majesty's American is an alternate future where the British Empire never crumbled. The spaceships of Her Majesty's Navy work to keep the spaceways safe. However, all is not quiet on the Western Front. The sons of Arnold are posed to attack from within, and warships of the theocratic caliphate enter the system, prepared to do their worst to destroy the hated empire head-on. Yet standing against the coming anarchy and tyranny is one intrepid spy prepared to risk all for Queen and Empire.
Today we have the first part of a 2-part podcast. The second part will be made available next week.
Hey, I want to welcome the editors and the authors of Grantville Gazette VIII to podcast. Hello, everyone.
Hi there.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Hey, we have a great gang here of wonderful writers, and all sort of helmed by the creator himself, Eric Flint. Eric Flint's a modern master of alternate history fiction with 3 million books in print, and he's the author and creator of the multiple New York Times bestselling Ring of Fire series, which we will be talking a lot more about. With David Drake, he's written 6 popular novels in the Belisarius alternate Roman history series, and with David Weber, collaborated on 1633 and 1634, part of the Ring of Fire series, and the Crown of Slaves series within David Weber's Honorverse. And Eric's latest solo Ring of Fire novel is The Ottoman Onslaught. You have one slated for next year, right, Eric?
Yeah, it's supposed to come out in April.
That'll be super cool. And for many years, Eric was a labor union activist. Now he lives near Chicago. Walt Boyce is the editor of the Industrial Automation Insider magazine, the editor of the Grantville Gazette, more germane to our discussion. Now, a member of the 1632 Universe editorial board, formerly editor of Control magazine and associate editor of Jim Baen's Universe. Along with Joy Award, Walt is co-editor of Eric Flint's Ring of Fire Press. Walt is an active member of SEFWA as well. So, Eric and Walt, what happens with these stories? So Grantville Gazette VIII is a collection of stories all set within this alternate history world that you, Eric, have created. So, for some of the listeners who have no idea what we're talking about, could you briefly recapitulate it?
Yeah, we started the magazine way back in 2003 originally it was just an occasional, something we'd put together occasionally, and it was a semi-pro magazine. We didn't pay professional rates. It was something I suggested to Jim as an experiment, and he thought it'd be interesting. He didn't want to deal with it himself, so he lent me the money so I could set it up, and that's how the magazine got launched. In 2007, we decided we could turn it into a professional magazine with a regular publication schedule and paying professional rates as established by Science Fiction Writers Association. So we did that. The first professional issue came out in May of 2007. Paula Goodlett was the editor at that point, and she continued to edit the magazine for, God, how many years was it, Paula?
Total about 10, but I started back with Gazette III.
Yeah.
Don't ask me the years because it's been a while.
Yeah. So Paul edited it for many years, and then she basically, got tired of it. Editing is tiring work, and besides that, she wanted to concentrate more on her own writing. So she stepped down as the editor, and I asked Walt to take it over, and he did. That was about, what, Walt, 3 years ago? 2 years ago?
About 3 years ago, I think.
We started, what Jim Baen did was he thought it'd be an interesting experiment to publish the first issue of the magazine as an actual paperback to see what would happen. So we did that, and it sold quite well. So we continued doing it, except that the next magazine, which was Grantville Gazette II, went out in hardcover first, and it did quite well. We did Gazettes 1, 2, 3, and 4, which were simply directly taking the magazine issue and turning it into a book. Once we got through 4, however, we realized this wasn't going to work because the magazine was just steaming ahead much, much faster than the books could be published. So starting with Gazette 5, we shifted to a different format, which is the more traditional best of format. And from that issue on, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and it'll continue like this. What happens is that we select stories from about 10 to 15 issues of the magazine and put those together as an anthology. That's the system we use now. The specific system we use is, I don't actually read the stories in the magazine when they first come out in the magazine. I have a very strong attitude about that publishers should keep their noses out of magazines and let the editors run them. And I partly have that attitude because Jim drove me nuts when I was editing his magazine. And which he had no excuse for doing because he'd been an editor himself at Galaxy Magazine. He knew damn good well you have to let editors run magazines. About the only decision a publisher really makes is to hire and fire the editor to begin with, and of course you pay all the bills. Anyway, so when it came time to put together Grantville Gazette VIII, I asked Walt and Joy. The two of them, Joy's not directly connected with the magazine, but in practice, she and Walt are the two co-editors of Ring of Fire Press. So the two of them went through the stories in the 15 issues we were going to pick from, and I don't recall offhand which issues those were. And they selected out of it a initial, I don't know what you'd call it, initial cut, we'll call it, of about twice as many stories as we were going to wind up with. And then I read them, and consulting with them, I made the final decision on which stories would go into the actual anthology itself. And that's actually the first time I see the stories as a rule, is when I together the paper anthologies. Did I overlook anything, Walt?
Only that I couldn't do the Gazette at all without Bjorn Hasseler, who is the managing editor. And you're right, Joy Ward did an awful lot of work picking the original complement of stories.
Now, could we take a step back momentarily, and I just want Eric to say again how this amazing sort of community of really good writers, I mean, it's fanfic in a way, but it's also high quality stuff. How this evolved, not too, I don't want to get into a huge history of it. We've done that before on the podcast, but it's fascinating how these talented people, you got them to write in your world, Eric. How did this happen? And it's not really your world anymore, is it? In a way.
No, it's really very much. It is in the sense that if I'm the final arbiter, if a decision needs to be made, but that actually quite rarely happens. It's become a very collective enterprise. Just so people understand how unusual this is, to the best of my knowledge, the only successful professional magazine ever, not just science fiction in any genre, that's based purely on a literary property. There have been magazines that have gone on for a number of issues based on media properties. There was a magazine called The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Star Trek, Star Wars, all those. But this is purely based on a literary. And it's now been professionally published for 11 years, and it's chugging right along. It's profitable. This never happened that I know of, and nobody I ever talked to can think of any other example anywhere.
I think it's the largest shared world universe in print ever.
I think that's quite possibly true. And what makes it especially unusual is that normally the way shared universes work is everybody uses the same setting, but the stories don't connect with each other much. Each author tends to have a bailiwick, so to speak, within a common setting, but the story lines of each work don't really interact with each other much. That's not at all true with the Ring of Fire series. Characters will first be... I once did an example using a character that Virginia first introduced. I think it was Minnie Hugelmeyer. And, I just showed how it wove in and out. Something she'd write, something I'd write, something we'd write together. That's kind of how it works. And I think what happens is partly I think we do attract aspiring writers who have some real talent. But the other thing that happens is because of the way we edit the magazine, it actually functions as a writer's workshop at the same time as a magazine because of the way we do it. We don't do it in the traditional way where if somebody submits a story across the transom and we either accept it or reject it. Instead, we have people submit it to a ongoing discussion area in Baen's website. And that gives people a chance to work on a story. They can rewrite it. Eventually, most of the stories aren't going to get selected, but the editors will oversee this process, and eventually they'll select out whichever stories they think are ready for prime time. So it works. It works quite well.
Yeah. It's we have yet another sterling collection. Well, let's talk about some of the stories, shall we? Let's start with Eric's story, just because I just want to say the title, Descartes Before the Whores, and that's not the only pun in this story. Hey, Eric, in this story, you are using the characters that came from Devil's Opera, right, that you and David Carrico wrote together?
Basically, yeah. I use those characters in one of my stories for Grantville Gazette VIII also. And David's used them for stories.
And then David pulled them. Yeah. And it's a mystery story within your universe. One of them is from the modern day West Virginia town that got thrown back in time, and the other is from contemporary times of the novel, which is the 1636 era at this point. Which is which? Cheeske's from the future, right?
Yeah. Byron Chesky is the American from the future, and Gotthilf Hook is the downtimer.
So Rene Descartes has been kidnapped, maybe.
Well, here's many years ago, Laura Runkle, who's one of the members of the editorial board of the magazine, came up with that pun. I don't remember what the context was, but the standard pun with Descartes is Descartes before the horse. But she came up with Descartes before the horse. And the minute I heard it, I swore I was someday going to write a story based on that title. And I finally decided to do it. That story is kind of, as a purely literary exercise, it's actually pretty impressive because the plot pivots around 5 puns. Every possible pun I could think of that had the same, Descartes before. And that's actually pretty tricky, making a plot work that you have to build around puns rather than the internal logic of the story itself. I was pleased with how it turned out. I mean, it's kind of lighthearted, but it's essentially a detective story. René Descartes, was alive at the time, but he wasn't famous yet. He was just on the verge of starting publishing the books that would eventually make him one of the most famous philosophers of all time. So he's unknown at the time to downtimers, but of course the uptimers, the Americans, know exactly who he is because even in West Virginia, in a small town West Virginia, René Descartes is going to be in a jillion books. And so that creates a kind of discord, or I don't know what you call it, a kind of disjunction of perception. And in the story, you find the downtimers say, what is the big deal about this guy anyway? Anyway, he gets kidnapped. And the story is just simply about these 2 detectives and a young woman, Elizabeth, I can never remember her last name, but she is a character who appears in my short novel Scarface in Ring of Fire 4. And she is back in Magdeburg, and she is working for a rag. It's basically based on a National Enquirer. It's a scandal sheet, and she's one who does actually a lot of the investigating. Anyway, I had a lot of fun writing it. And that's how the story came into existence. It's also part of a long tradition I have, which started with me and Jim Baen. And then after Jim passed away, Tom Kidd, our artist, and I continue it, where the artist does the cover first. And then I fit the story to match the cover. It's kind of a enjoyable exercise, and I think keeps me sort of limber.
Yeah, this is a great cover. Once again, Tom Kidd does all these Ring of Fire covers, and I believe that he paints them, that they actually are oil paintings.
I actually recently at a convention, I can't remember which one, Tom was the artist guest of honor. He had a whole display of his work, quite, a number of which are or Ring of Fire covers, and yeah, they're real paintings. You can buy them. They are not cheap.
They are not cheap. But you can get one a lot cheaper if you just buy the book and you can look at it there.
Yeah, exactly.
On the dust jacket. So one other thing about this story is the playing around with time that you always do with these stories, in that things are not going to be the same in the future of this world, because people from the future have come back to the past. And in this case, the little leader of the town believes that she is perhaps going to have killed Descartes in the other world, right? By making
that's the Princess Christina. What happened in real history was that when Descartes was middle-aged, about 50, thereabouts, by then she was Christina. Gustav Adolf was killed at the Battle of Lutzen, and she was inherited, and she was the Queen of Sweden. And she was an extraordinarily smart woman, but had all kinds of issues. And she invited Descartes to come move to Stockholm, and because she wanted basically to be tutored by, a great philosopher. And he accepted because it was kind of an all expenses paid, it gave him a living. The problem was that she insisted on him meeting her at 5 a.m, and he would often have to, walk through the Swedish winter in order to, get to the palace, and that's usually blamed for the fact that he came down pneumonia. Now, whether it's actually what caused the pneumonia or not, who the hell knows? But that's the way it is in the history books. And so Christina, who in the series is about 9 years old, she comes across this story, and she's very upset because, apparently she's responsible for killing this guy. And her American governess, Carolyn Platzer, is frustrated with her because she's like a strangler, because the girls are, kind of all worked up over it, even though she says this happened in a completely different universe that's never going to happen in this one. So, why? Anyway, but that's what triggers off a lot of what happens.
Yeah. Well, it's a really fun story, and it's a lighthearted mystery that has a cool little complex mystery plot. Speaking of historical characters, Virginia DeMarce, we meet Robert Herrick, the poet, in your story, which is called Historically Well Preserved. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to use Robert Herrick, and can you introduce yourself briefly as well, Virginia?
Yes, I will. I'm Virginia DeMarce. I've been an academic historian all of my life. This particular story was a great deal of fun because, in a way, it was homage to a few years when I was dealing with children at home and was only working part-time as a kind of general gopher for the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, in the context of which I became reasonably well acquainted and frustrated with many people devoted to the cause of historic preservation. The story also pulls together, as Eric said, various types of things that are shared in the universe. It features the Leda Riddle, who was prominent in our collection of Brillo stories that Paula Goodlett invented. I borrowed the two Englishmen from Karen Offord's story about getting smallpox vaccine out of England. And then I threw Robert Herrick into the mix as a kind of illustration of what the life of the English clergy was like when a position as a clergyman was really the only practical way for a poet to support himself, whether he was religiously inclined or not. So basically, I took elements from a variety of things and threw them into the stew on the issue of getting some kind of quasi-permanent Episcopalian clergyman in Grantville, spearheaded by the leader Riddle, the only kamikaze Episcopalian in the United States, which Grantville happened to transfer back.
A lot of this story is about pastor selection, which is a very interesting plot device to pick.
Well, Bjorn Hasseler manages to write stories about biblical text interpretation. I don't see why this would be any odder.
What were you going to say, Eric? I'm sorry.
Well, there's the interconnections are more complex even than this, because I had two motives in picking a story. One is it's a good story. The other, though, was more selfish. I'm developing my own subplot that starts figuring prominently in the Ottoman onslaught, where the small Episcopal church that came through the Ring of Fire, and it's quite small, there weren't very many Episcopalians in Grantville, is becoming the channel. It's the church that Gretchen Richter chose to belong to when Gustav Adolf basically gave her kind of an ultimatum, saying, if you're going to be governor of Saxony, you have to belong to some religion, because I'm damn well not going to have a governor who's not affiliated with some denomination. And she was raised a Catholic, but for reasons that go back into the story, she's disaffected with the Catholic Church, but on the other hand, she's not very fond of most Protestant churches, and Episcopalians sort of come the closest to keeping a lot of the Catholic tradition she likes without being Catholic. So she converts and becomes an Episcopalian. Well, this puts what Virginia described as samurai Episcopalianism on steroids, and it's going to be, I think, quite entertaining to see how the Episcopal Church evolves especially in Saxony and then in Silesia, as a church that is very, very, very unlike the Episcopal Church that people think of. So anyway, that's part of the reason I brought the story in, because it provides some of the background, some of the things I'm doing.
For bringing in Herrick, I just wanted to make a little bit of fun of those 17th century poets who had damsels dancing daintily on dewdrops in the spring, and I had to write the sentence in which Herrick reflects to himself as he is spending 6 months in exile in Grantville dealing with the local parish, that real women had a tendency to trudge through slush in sturdy boots. They just didn't measure up to his imagination. And then, of course, Laud makes him get married at the end to a sensible Episcopalian widow.
One of the great things, you really develop Herrick's character in here, and one of the fun things about him is he's such a damn snob.
Well, of course.
He really thinks he's better than these people. Is this based on Herrick's actual character, or did you just sort of think,
yeah.
Well, he would be?
No. Yes. When I do historical, as I say, I'm a historian. When I do historical people, I keep them just as close as I can to their actual character. And I use as much as I can of direct quotes from their writings.
Yeah, I see that you have actually done that with the Herrick character. It's really a story about women who are getting something done in the way that they can with the power that they have, right? Mm-hmm. Because Herrick is what's being done is the guy that's being done to here.
Yeah. In real congregations, that is not an infrequent situation.
Well, I can attest to that. Well, let's talk to Griffin about Bank on It, Griffin Barber. This is a heist story of sorts, and you're a cop, right?
Yes, I am.
tell us a little bit about your background and tell us a little bit about how the story. I believe it takes place in Geneva, right? How it came about.
Yeah. Well, I happened to spend part of my youth in Geneva, Switzerland, and so that was kind of the write what you know aspect of it. Yes, I've been a cop for 18 years now, and I wrote this story back when Paula Goodlett was the lead editor at the magazine, and she was gracious enough to accept it. But the kind of the funny thing about how it all came about was is kind of how people get brought in. It's now to its third and fourth generation of degrees of separation from Eric. So I met Chuck Gannon at World Fantasy about 7 or 8 years ago. He read some of my stuff that I just posted on a blog and said, hey, you got to write for this Grantville Gazette. And I kind of poo-pooed the idea because I was a novelist, yada, 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 that kind of thing. And he came back the next year when I still hadn't sold anything and said, hey, how's that going for you? So I turned around and sucked it up and read 1632. I was already familiar with Eric from his work with Dave Drake on the Belisarius series, which I quite enjoyed. But I read the 1632 and I went, okay, I can maybe work with this. And I did some studying up and I wrote the short story. And I wrote about 90% of the story, but I couldn't get the technical aspect because me not have science background. And I needed the science MacGuffin to kind of come through for me. So the next time Chuck asked me where the heck my story was, I said, well, I can't get any help from anybody about this science question I have. And he rallied the troops, and Rick Boatwright, who is a common resource for many of the authors in the 1632 universe, totally helped me out and solved my question and helped me through finalizing the story. And it was the first short story I ever submitted, and Paula was, like I said, gracious enough to buy it. So, and then shortly after that, I made my second, third, and fourth sales to the Grantville Gazette and qualified for SIFWA, and then I got a novel with Eric, 1636 Mission of the Moogles.
Mission of the Moogles, yes, which was out last year. Then it's going to be out in mass market, or is, yeah. Tell us about Gervais, who is a great character, who reminds me a lot of maybe a Donald Westlake villain or someone like that. He's stuck with this real snob of a Frenchman to start with.
Oh, the Savoyard. He's actually, he's more of a Northern Italian to our modern sensibility. But yeah, the Savoyard is from the Piedmontese, the area that's now Switzerland and northwestern Italy. Anyway, Vicario is the main bad guy. So living in Geneva, I had been around for a number of the celebrations of the Escalade, which they hold every year, which is celebrated with cauldrons of chocolate and stuff like that for kids and things like that. Whereas what happened was that a woman, and I can't remember her name, the Savoyard was trying to reconquer his lost city and went back to Geneva and tried to take it in a night attack, a sneak attack. And the troops that attacked were disavowed by that Savoyard Duke. And so they basically were all executed without the remedy of having a ransom and that kind of thing. So Vicario is a jerk and an ass, but he kind of has his reasons for doing that, which I always like to explore.
It's fun. Gervais is a sly fellow, but he's not the perfect thief. And there's also your spy in training, whose name I can't remember, but he's a fun character in the story as well. Bertram Wyman, yeah. He's a distant relation to the Sephardic Jews that have been connected with with Grantville since it's coming across time.
Well, it's a great fun caper story, and with some really strong characterization.
Yeah, I
Go ahead.
enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed writing it quite a bit, and because the cathedral is very much dominant in Geneva. If you go into the old town, which I hung around a lot in, and drank a lot in, and generally made an American of myself in. So it was neat for me to be able to include it.
How old were you when you lived in Geneva?
From 16 to 21.
So you really know the place.
I try to, yeah. I like to think I do. I'm sure I know very little about the actual historical politics. That was one of the challenges for me, was to try and figure out because it was ruled by a council for a long period of time after Calvin passed away. So there wasn't a whole lot of there weren't a lot of people that stood out in the historical record. And while I speak French, I read it very, very poorly and very, very slowly. So that was a challenge for me as well.
Well, answered well in this story at least. So Bjorn Hasseler, you're going to have to probably Bibel. I'm married to German. I still can't say it right. Your title.
I'm going to say Bibelgesellschaft, but Virginia is welcome to correct me.
That is correct. Bibelgesellschaft.
And this is a riveting story, a really fun sort of action-filled story that's all about something like hermeneutics or something like that, right?
Textual criticism, actually.
Oh, okay. Can you explain what these people are after here?
There are some students who started out in a fight at school because they were working from different texts of the Bible, and after the fight got sorted out, they found out that their copies were actually different. They were based on different manuscripts. So they are recreating the Deutsche Bibelgesellschaft from Uptime, which is the organization that publishes the compiled Greek New Testament.
The idea is to get the most accurate biblical translation available, so everybody's sort of on the same page in all these religious argumentations.
Right.
And our heroine, or at least our viewpoint character, is Katharina. Who is she?
Katharina Meissner is a high school student now at Grantville High School, but she's a downtimer, and she is Brethren, what we would call Anabaptist. So they have been trickling into Grantville since basically the beginning of the series because they have freedom of worship there.
So she's a downtimer.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And she is probably pretty good at basketball, but she doesn't really feel like doing that because she's more interested in figuring out what is actually the right Old Testament and the New Testament.
Right. She's just working on the New Testament at the moment. Later on, she starts trying to pick up a little bit of Hebrew, but at this point in the story, she's taking Greek in the high school. They're offering that because it's simply expected at university in that time period.
And what are some of the? So they go on a journey, and some people are trying to stop them from being able. Where are they going? What is going to be accomplished at this meeting?
They are headed to the University of Jena, which is about 30 miles or so from Grantville. And they are trying to recruit downtime scholars to help them. They're specifically looking for Johann Gerhardt to get on board. He is the top Lutheran theologian alive in the time period. And they meet up with another student who's checking out the University of Jena. His name is Johannes Musaeus. He is a historical downtimer, and he becomes the leader of the Lutheran students within the Bible Society.
And who is opposed to them? Why would anybody want to stop them from doing this?
Well, we were talking about borrowing characters. I borrowed Pastor Holtz from Virginia, and Holtz has been the leader of a very hyper-Orthodox faction of Lutherans within Grantville, all downtimers, and he does not like the cooperation he sees in the Bible Society between Anabaptists, Lutherans, and Catholics. And he would just assume that they all just do what his version of the Lutheran Church tells them to.
And he is quite willing to oppose them physically if he has to.
Yes, he does that in a number of stories by different authors over the course of the series.
What a jerk.
Remember, in this period, there was the phrase, odium theologicum, the willingness of theologians to feud with one another. And it was not limited to verbal and written feuding. It often spilled over into riots.
People took these things very seriously. Well, it's a really fun story, and it certainly brought to life a portion of Bible scholarship that I did not think could be brought to life. It made it fun. So, well, let's move on to Robert Waters, The Heirloom, which is another it's a moving story, and really a look inside of two viewpoints, one uptime and one downtime, particularly the uptimer who hasn't really assimilated, who hasn't found a way to fit in yet. Who is, what is her name? Ella Lou Rice. Yeah. Can you tell us about
Ella
this?
Lou Rice, yeah.
And tell us a little bit.
Sure. Well, just quickly,
a little about yourself as well, please.
Yeah. I'm Robert Waters. In my day job, I work in a gaming company. I've worked in the gaming industry since 1994. Right now I'm working for a company called Breakaway Games. What we do is what they call serious games. We develop and design games for medical training, usually, and also financial training, and anybody that comes to us that has some cash that needs gaming and simulations in order to help train their employees or members in some capacity or another. That's what I do in my day job. So, the Heirloom, basically what this story is about is there's an uptime family called the Rice family. John Rice, the father, Ella Lou Rice, the mother, and their son Clyde Rice. Now, they're the only three members of this family that came through the Ring of Fire. The rest of the family was left uptime. So it's a split family. And when the story begins, John Rice, who is a World War II veteran, has already died. He passed away in 1635, and of course he survived then, of course, by his wife and his son. And Ella is not coping well with coming through the Ring of Fire. And she's not like some of the other characters in the series that have really made a name for themselves, or rich, or they're famous, or both. She's miserable. She just doesn't like it, and now she's just lost her husband. So what in the world is she going to do? So what she decides that she's going to do to try to find some meaning in her life and some purpose is to take this medallion, or this heirloom, that her husband got in World War II from a German soldier, and give this medallion back to the family, the ancestors of this German soldier from World War II. But the genealogy search is just virtually impossible. It's just there's no good records. There's displacement of families, war, and everything. It's near impossible to be able to try to trace this heirloom back to its origination. And the soldier in World War II, the German soldier that basically helped her husband survive the Battle of the Bulge, said that it's around 300 years old or so. So she figures it's probably right around that time where it might have been made. So she can't find the family. But what she does know is that the heirloom came from a small town called Darmstadt, Darmstadt, Germany, which happens to be, it was a town in the 17th century. It was a town in World War II. So she decides that, in order to, as sort of an altruistic gesture, she will give this heirloom to the town as sort of like a thank you for giving the world at some point a son who will save her husband from dying, in the freezing cold of the Battle of the Bulge. So that's what the story's about. It's about a woman who's trying to find some purpose and some meaning in her life now that she's in a situation where she, has just been sort of forced into.
We've gotten these great stories about kind of loser uptimers like Bernie, who Paula and Gorg write about, who really transformed their lives when they got this sort of second chance by being thrown back into the past. But she hasn't quite done that. She got cut off from her family, right? I mean, she's felt unmoored.
Yeah, like I said, most of her family was left up time. I mean, it was just a total shock to them. It's a cultural shock, and she's an elderly lady. She's in her 70s. She's pushing close to 80, I think, herself, and so, she's not going to get used to it. It's just not something that is just going to be able to just go right in and just do it. She misses CNN. She misses the uptime amenities. She misses them all. She misses all these things, but she's stuck. Just like everyone else that came through the Ring of Fire, and they've got to find some way to cope with the situation, and that's what she does. She tries to, and so she takes this amulet or this medallion to the town to try to find some peace, with the situation.
Now, there's some really cool World War II battle scenes in this as well, because she is recounting or remembering what her husband has told her about what's good. Did you do some research on this as well? It's kind of cool that you guys can work in other histories as well.
Well, yeah, that was one of the parts that it was a little, to me, kind of a little tricky in how to structure the story so that I could jump between times, because I start the story in 1626, actually, prior to the Ring of Fire, and then I jump into the, I guess our modern time or the current age, which is the 1635, and then I jump ahead of time, like you say, when Lou is recounting the story that her husband tells about meeting this German soldier, and so I had to. It was a challenge, a bit of a challenge to try to jump from time to time to time and try to make it all work. And it just so happens that around the time that I was thinking about writing this story, I happened to be watching the HBO show Band of Brothers, and there are 2 episodes of that series that are in the Ardennes, and a lot of foxholes, a lot of coals, a lot of death and misery. And I thought to myself, this might be an interesting place to see if I could put a story. Actually, to tell you the truth, the story was inspired by reading 1635, The Bavarian Crisis. There's a scene in that book where Mary Simpson, I believe it is sort of thinking back or reflecting on her life as the wife of a naval officer. And to me, it was very touching and very honest, sort of an introspection. And I thought to myself, well, there's got to be other ladies, uptimers who have come through who might be able to find some kind of, have that kind of relationship or a moment with their as being the wife of an officer or a soldier. So that's really where the germ of the story began.
Yeah, well, it's a really touching and moving, and it's got a really cool finish to it as well.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil that. We don't want to.
No. But it's excellent work.
That was the first part of a 2-part interview. The next part will be available next week.
This is another entry in Alliance of Equals, a Liaden Universe novel by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. Beset by the angry remnants of the Department of the Interior, and challenged at every turn by opportunists on their new homeworld of Surebleak, and low on funds, Clan Corville desperately needs to reestablish its position as one of the top trading clans in known space. To this end, Master Trader Sean Yoskalen and Corville's premier trade ship Dutiful Passage is on a mission to establish new business associations and to build a strong primary route that links well with existing loops and secondary routes. But reestablishing trade and preserving the lives of the few remaining members of the clan aren't all of Corval's problem. Matters come to a head as Dutiful Passage, accustomed to being welcomed and feted at those ports on its call list, finds itself denied docking and blacklisting while agents of the DOI mounted armed attacks on others of Corville's traders under the very eyes of port security systems. Traveling with Dutiful Trader on this unsettling journey is Paddy Yoskalen, the master trader's heir and his apprentice. Paddy is eager to make up for time lost due to Corville's unpleasantness with the Department of the Interior, but she is also keeping a secret so intense that her coming of age and perhaps her very life is threatened by it. And here is the latest entry in Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Alliance of Equals.
Paddy hunched under her bowl, shivering and sick. She remembered the feel of bone snapping beneath her hand, giving before her kick. She had never. Her first kills. She had intended to kill both men. She had carried forth on her intentions to success and survival. And she never wanted to be forced to do so again. He could find it in him to be angry at Inky, despite his understanding of the conditions she labored under. She could have left the Admiral out of the equation, but, well, no, maybe not. Tolly sighed and scrubbed his hands over his face as the drying cycle came on. He hoped it hurt her, what she'd done. He thought it did hurt her. Inky was a pro. She knew the conditions of the Admiral's birth. His first conscious act had been to kill a ship full of sentient beings. Killing would always be an option for him, so long as he could convince ethics and protocol that it had been done to preserve himself, or in defense of his crew. It was the job of the Admiral's mentors to teach him that there were alternatives. Better alternatives. And what does Inky do but set up a situation in which the Admiral could claim self-defense in the murder of a mentor? Damn the woman. The dryer shut off, and he stepped out of the fresher, padding the couple of steps into his quarters and picking up the pants he'd left across the bunk. For himself, personally, it hardly mattered who killed him, so long as he didn't come into the care of the school beforehand. But for the harm done to the Admiral, yeah, he could be, he was, angry. If Inky, as was probable, had set a mandate for the Admiral to return to her or wait at a certain location, she might even intend to protect him, but Inky wasn't reliable. She knew that. He pulled the sweater over his head, sighed, and just stood there in his quarters, arms hanging at his side. Suddenly, he laughed. Because really, there wasn't any choice but the one the Admiral offered. He, Tollance Barrick Jones, greatest of the age or not, was a mentor, and he knew what was due to his student, and what was due to the universe and to biologic life. He also knew, right down in the deep core of him, just exactly what a person was capable of doing when they wanted their freedom above everything else. "Stop!" Sean said sharply. His arm, he dared not look at his arm. Instead, he enclosed the pain and sealed it away. "Open to me." Torona Rusk sounded calm and faintly disappointed. "It does not have to be a rape, little healer. Only surrender. I cannot surrender, he told her, projecting honesty as strongly as he dared. I am of Corval. Try to force me, and you create resistance in equal measure to your demands. If you wish an examination, I suggest that we must find another way. She considered him with a sapient eye. You are now willing to become my student? I am willing to allow you to examine me and the resources available to me, he said, keeping his voice smooth with an effort. Gods, what damage had she done him? The pain was already seeping through his seals like blood through paper. He dared a glance downward and grit his teeth. Those would scar. All he had to do was live long enough. It is a poor teacher who does not also learn from her students, Torona Rusk commented. How would you have us proceed to a solution that profits us both? I suggest that we comport ourselves as healers, he said. I will extend to you one single line, as you will extend one single line to me. We will allow the lines to meet and to commingle. Thus, a fraction of your energy becomes part of me, while a small fraction of my energies become part of you. She smiled suddenly, wide and delighted. In fact, we would learn to trust each other. Exactly, he said. Once trust is established, and we know each other a little better, an examination, even an intervention, may go forth. I commend you. This is a valuable suggestion. For you know that I would have you trust me above all things. He bowed his head slightly and let her read meekness in him, and a certain well-hid awe of herself. We shall make this attempt, she announced. I extend the grace of goodwill to my newest student. He saw it, with inner eyes, a cobalt thread, chaste and demure. Gently, he extended his own thread, also demure, and perhaps a little inclined to waver. The energies met and mingled. He tasted steel and vinegar, shivered with her need to hold and possess. He heard her sigh as his thread reached her senses, tempting her with compliance and a sweet desire to obey. She was quick. Very nearly, she was too quick. She jerked on her extended thread, but they were enwrapped now, and he had no wish to disengage. Treachery! She snapped. The lash came, striking his cheek this time, even as he thrust his will down the fragile linkage, past their joining point, and into the sear and tangled pattern of Torona Rusk. Brittle threads scratched and burned him. He ignored them, stretching his will wide, wider than ever he had attempted, until at last he enclosed the whole sticky mass, whereupon he snatched all of it, all of them, into heel space. The security guard is with the Yosgalan. The language was Liaden, the mode between comrades, perfectly audible to Patty's ears as she crouched beneath her bowl. And yet, said a second voice, we have 2 dead, efficiently so, and a suite that is empty of else. They had searched the suite. She had heard that too. It was rather inefficient, having to depend only on her ears. She would have liked to see this new pair of enemies, so that she might have identified them to port security. In fact, it came to her that, the bowl being her construction, she might modify it thus. Then it came to her that the bowl was not, precisely, her construction. It had felt to her as if she had reached out and snatched the very bowl from the table beside her bunk. Her thought, some way stretching it until it was large enough to cover her. Or perhaps she had shrunk somehow in order to fit beneath. In any case, she told herself, you don't know enough. Best to stay hidden until they give up and go. However, they seemed in no hurry to go. She heard them moving about again, soft floofs that may have been cushions landing on the carpet after having been thrown from chairs, and if they thought she might be hiding behind the chair cushions, then they must be as stupid as the Department of the Interior. The halfling has abilities, the first voice said. It is the reason we are sent to find her, not merely because she is the Yosgalan's heir and may be used to control him. Paddy drew a careful breath. We, however, do not have abilities, the second voice pointed out. How if the heir has already flown out the window? Flying is not so usual a thing, and the heir is young after all. Perhaps we might think of a more common subterfuge, such as any halfling might employ, hiding, for an instance. These people did not sound at all stupid, Paddy thought, wrapping her arms around her knees. More the pity. Let us quarter the room, the first voice said, and see what we may find. The Dramlisa will not be pleased if we do not bring the heir or her body. You recall what she did to El Fazik. You make an eloquent point. Let us, as you say, quarter the room.
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. And that's all for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com and to the podcast theme composer Ruth Jukowitz. And the complete breakdown of quantum mechanics across 5 solar systems, plus thanks, adoring fans, and maybe a parade to editors Eric Flint, Walt Boys, and authors Bjorn Hasseler, Carolyn Palmer, Gorg Huff, Griffin Barber, Paula Goodlett, Robert Waters, and Virginia DeMarce from the Grantville Gazette.
Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy. And as always, keep reaching for the stars.